Good evening. My name is Stephen Noerper. Welcome to the Korea Society. Wonderful to have you here in our still relatively new home. We're celebrating 1 year here now, and it has been absolutely fantastic. As you can see, this great grand space with the adjacent gallery, a private meeting room, and an upstairs with a terrace have opened up new vistas for us creatively and programmatically. It is a pleasure to have all of you here at this critically important time as we follow on this potentially historic summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. That following on the inter-Korean summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. We thought we would turn to two Washington insiders who happen to also be thought leaders nationally and internationally on the Asia front, and with keen eyes to Korea. One directly to my right is Frank Jannuzi, who is the president of the Mansfield Foundation and who has a long and illustrious record of public service and served as a senior advisor within the United States Senate for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and helped form approaches and processes for people like John Kerry and Joe Biden when they served as chairpersons of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In a similar capacity was Keith Luse, who worked very closely with Richard Lugar, the esteemed senator from Indiana. And Keith now is the executive director of the National Committee on North Korea. To that end, I highly recommend to all of you and to those of you streaming online or listening via podcast or watching via YouTube video to please go to ncnk.org to see the good work of the National Committee on North Korea, as well as to the Mansfield Foundation, which does prolific work on Asia and which honors the legacy of Senator Mike Mansfield. You'll see we have a small portrait of him here. Our chairman at the Korea Society, Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, worked early in his career for Senator Mansfield, and we've done several programs at the Korea Society on Senator Mansfield, as well as out at the Mansfield Library and the Mansfield Center in Missoula, Montana. So he's a special individual, his memory to us, and so that's a special connection we have with Frank as well. So you have before you two gentlemen who are keen minds and who have been great public servants and who have also spent a lot of time traveling to North Korea during their time with Senate Foreign Relations and who have been interlocutors with North Koreans since. And I would like to turn to them now at this time and say, welcome and give us your take on how this has gone and where we're going. Frank, why don't we start with you?
I normally defer to the majority party.
He said, let Frank go first.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really a pleasure for me to be back in New York. I really appreciate that the Korea Society draws together an educated audience concerned about global affairs, and I learn tremendously by interacting with you, and I look forward to your questions. I think it's important to understand how we got here. To me, there are three strategic changes on the peninsula and around the peninsula that brought us to this moment, this extraordinary moment of a summit meeting between a sitting American president and a leader of North Korea. The first change is something that happened in South Korea a year ago, the election of Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in is a veteran from the Sunshine Engagement strategy of dealing with North Korea. He was a close advisor to two previous South Korean presidents, dating back to Kim Dae-jung, who was the original architect of the Sunshine Engagement strategy. And in Moon Jae-in, the North Koreans have an interlocutor who they know, who they mostly trust, and who they know is committed to a process of peace, a non-coercive process, one that is rooted in mutual respect. And his election and the fact that he's going to be president for 4 more years, serving one term, limited, was the first really big strategic change. And the second change is Kim Jong-un himself, consolidating his rule after now 6 years in office, installing key people in all of the key positions. including in every county of North Korea, where he has promoted party bosses from the Korean Workers' Party, and he's reinvigorated the role of the party. And not only has he consolidated his own political hold on power, but he's also consolidated his nation's limited nuclear deterrent. Most recently testing a boosted fission weapon with 10 times the destructive power of Hiroshima. That's a serious bomb, not a small bomb. And the delivery systems to bring it to the United States, right, by missile. So that's the second big change. You have a more confident, secure North Korean leader. And the third change is Donald Trump, special spice, mercurial, self-interested, and wanting to make history by ending the Korean War, one way or the other. And the fact that Donald Trump injected a degree of priority and drama into the Korean Peninsula issue is what has brought us to this point. No drama Obama had a lot of advantages in terms of the calm management of international affairs, but with North Korea, a little bit of drama can sometimes be catalytic. And I think Trump's drama has helped him to bring Kim Jong-un to the table. So anyway, that's enough of an overview. I'll turn to Keith, but I think it's really important to understand why we got here, because we didn't get here just because of maximum pressure. And we didn't get here just because Kim Jong-un wanted to make a deal. We got here for a combination of reasons. And that should inform our efforts to understand what's going to come next.
Keith.
Steve and I join Frank in thanking you and the Korea Society for having us this evening. This is a very important time. It's a dangerous time. It's a critical time. But in reflecting upon tonight's session, I recalled my first trip to North Korea 16 years ago. And for me, that first trip was quite surreal. Through a 7-day period, I was taken aback by what I saw. I learned new things. Some points that I observed were with disbelief. But what stuck in my mind the most upon departing the country was the fact that so many North Korean decisions about the United States were based, in my opinion, on incomplete or faulty analysis. Well, that was bothersome because days after returning, I knew we really are closer to war than what I had imagined. Now, that was 16 years ago, and my concern about North Korea. Today, I must say that I have, and I apologize, I worked full-time on North Korea issues for the last 3.5, almost 4 years. Prior to that,
His hair was black before.
Prior to that with Frank.
Totally black.
But in recent days, I have been so concerned by the general response to the summit. It seems to me that so many analysts, commentators, people in general, are unable to separate their disdain for the president, their dislike of the president, to separate that dislike from what could in fact be an important beginning in U.S.-North Korea relations. It's as if there is a season of amnesia which is set in. It's not been but a few weeks when we were close to war with North Korea. People say, well, Keith, it would only have been a military strike, surgical strike on the part of the U.S. Well, what would that have resulted on the North Korean end? I do believe that after the summit was announced, that the people of Tokyo and Seoul probably slept better, and North Korea, at least for a while. So there's the amnesia component as well. But I must say that while this is an important beginning, it is my opinion that this will not be successful long term unless there is a monitoring mechanism, some type of process, perhaps headed by a Singaporean or someone from a country respected by both leaders, to actually oversee the agreement and its various components, and to publicly report what is happening or not happening. Now, Secretary Pompeo deserves so much credit for getting us where we are today. And he started this process as head of the CIA, working with North Korean counterparts. He's now Secretary of State, and so in addition to now pulling the State Department into the process, he's continuing to utilize the CIA in connecting with the North. That's good news. However, Secretary Pompeo, as Secretary, now has the entire world to worry about. So he is going to be unable to give the North Korea situation the attention that he has thus far. So there needs to be a monitoring mechanism in place of some sort. Again, the agreement was simply a beginning. Indeed, several points of concern, of interest to both countries were not included in the agreement, and they need to be covered between the United States and North Korea. I was pleased to see that the issue of, as stated in the agreement, remains of U.S. military personnel from the Korean War be addressed. Well, that's insufficient. That's not enough. You know, at the end of the Korean War, there were 8,000 Americans unaccounted for. And consecutive U.S. administrations have been inconsistent in including this topic as a priority with the North Koreans. So yes, we should in fact work to obtain as many remains as possible. But the North Koreans need to be provided opportunity to respond to questions about what about the Americans who were in North Korea still alive at the end of the war? What happened to them? Yes, some went to Russia, some went to China. So again, it's great that this point is included. It's something that Frank and I both worked on when we were in the Senate. In our respective positions today, we continue to work on this issue. But there are other issues as well. Now, some of this may be addressed through ongoing channels as established by Pompeo and North Koreans. But I'm hopeful that the direct contact, which President Trump has inferred has been occurring between he and Kim Jong-un, I hope that continues. And I hope that if there is a situation in the future, sooner or later, that again gets to the crisis point, that they talk to each other and help work through that situation. So let me just conclude with that.
Oh, that's interesting. And also the fact that Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un were able to organize a summit within 24 hours and seem to be maintaining a very close communication line only reinforces what you're saying. Frank, you look like you wanted to add on there.
I was just going to say briefly on the MIA issue, because it's something that Keith and I care passionately about. My first visit to North Korea in 2001, I visited with the Korean Army unit that was preparing to dig in the dirt and look for remains alongside American soldiers. And most Americans, if you ask them, was there ever a time during the 1990s and the 2000s when there were boots on the ground, U.S. military personnel in uniform inside North Korea? They would look at you like you were crazy. But for almost 10 years, we had dozens of American soldiers working inside North Korea alongside North Korean Army soldiers, digging for the remains of our soldiers left behind in the Korean War. And what that did is it established two important things. One is confidence and security building measure, because as long as our troops are on the ground in North Korea, guess what? We're not going to go to war with North Korea while those troops are in there. And the other thing is that you learn a lot. And I won't elaborate, but let's just say that it's not a bad thing to have 3 or 4 dozen American soldiers on the ground inside North Korea on a yearly basis. Their eyes are open, their ears are open. They learn things, as you would, anyone would, who visits North Korea. So I think it's really important. And what was curious, though, was that was the only specific engagement point agreed in this joint statement. Everything else was platitudes about denuclearization, peace, getting to know each other. All of those are good things. But it was a pretty thin gruel when you tried to look at what the substance was on denuclearization. So it was curious to me that the one little bit of substance was this issue. And I want to say one more thing about it, which is the U.S.-Vietnam normalization process was rooted in the recovery of the remains of American service personnel left behind from the Vietnam War. I know for a fact that the North Koreans have studied that normalization process. They've studied that normalization roadmap that I helped to draft when I was at the State Department in 1990. And they know the importance of getting American veterans and the American military supportive of a process of peace. So I think that this issue has significance that might be a little greater than at first meets the eye.
Interesting. An interesting analogy. So in the last few days, picking up on some of what you said, some of the proponents of this process emphasize just that this Olympic moment is now an Olympic process, and that we're on a road that will require a lot of what you said, Keith, in terms of follow-on and structures and due diligence. And that's a victory in and of itself, and should be the major focus of where we are right now. However, there's probably a much larger number of critics who say, look, fine, you had one specific point. Okay, they may buy your argument about it being a foundation. But we didn't get there in terms of a hard commitment by way of denuclearization. And there's nothing that's holding them to this. And beyond that, Donald Trump gave away the show by promising that military exercises, war games, would be eliminated, and that perhaps troop reductions or withdrawal may be in his long-term vision. And so that it appears on the upfront that the U.S. is doing that. And how is that the art of his deal? So, maybe you have some thoughts on that, because there do seem to be extremes. We don't seem to see a comfortable middle. We seem to have people who say, great, we have a ball rolling. And then we seem to have a very large number of people saying, what did we really get from this?
I think that to some degree that's a fair criticism. At the same time, we must not forget that there was a private discussion between the two leaders, details of which have not been shared. This is so trying to critique the summit or the statement based upon the entirety of the statement or the optics, that's really missing quite a bit. It's like trying to conduct an analysis of a glacier underwater when actually all you see is the tip of the iceberg. I'm interested in knowing what's under the water. What, in fact, was agreed to between the two leaders, or what understanding does President Trump have? What understanding does Kim Jong-un have? Time will tell.
Yeah, I agree with Keith. It's really premature to finalize any assessment of this summit. We can say a few things about it. We can say that the U.S., by the mere fact of sitting down with a sitting U.S. president, meeting with Kim Jong-un, that is a gift of tremendous legitimacy, prestige, respect to the North Korean leader and to the North Korean system, which has previously been withheld. So without question, it is a gift of real value. And if the administration says, well, we didn't give anything to the North Koreans, well, no, they did. They gave something of tangible value. But I'm also one of those people who believes that in this relationship between the United States and North Korea is the weaker power by far in every measure. And if the stronger power wants to bestow a gift on the weaker power in order to get what we want, that can be a smart move. And we don't know yet whether we're going to get what we want. I suspect it's going to prove more difficult than President Trump thinks to get what we want. But the fact that the president now embraces this as a long process rather than some sort of an overnight magical denuclearization is a good thing. It shows that he's being more realistic than he was before. And my major concern about the summit, Steve, is just that there are some recognizable potential pitfalls ahead of us. And to me, the most important two of them, one has to do with denuclearization. The North Koreans say they want a denuclearized peninsula. And South Korea has nuclear power. And South Korea enriches uranium. And North Korea is very conscious of having equal status with their South Korean neighbor. So I presume, I can't prove it, but I presume that North Korea in the future wants to have peaceful nuclear power, including the right to enrich uranium. Now, I'm pretty darn sure that the US side thinks that both of those activities would be forbidden under a denuclearization game plan. So as far as I know, that difference hasn't been worked out yet. And there's another looming roadblock to this road trip that we're on, and that is space launch, as distinct from ICBMs. Because South Korea has a space program, they launch satellites. North Korea has launched successfully a satellite. They want to launch more, and they don't believe that a peaceful space launch program should in any way be considered a threat. And the reality is that there are some dual-use technologies involved in both ICBMs and space launch, but there also are differences between putting a nuclear warhead on a missile, sending it up into space, having it survive re-entry and land on the target and detonate as planned, versus putting an object up into space. They're not the same, technically. And I'm pretty sure the North Koreans expect to be able to preserve a peaceful use of space as a sovereign nation.
And we do have a big anniversary coming.
And we have a big anniversary coming up in September, which they like to celebrate with rockets and red glare and fireworks. So I worry that both of these issues need to be addressed, and I'm confident that the U.S. side knows they need to address it, but I'm much less confident that it will be easy to reach consensus with the North Koreans on it.
Do you think we might see Kim Jong-un here for the opening of the UN General Assembly? Do you think we're on a process that could lead to some visits? And
I think without question, two things are going to happen, and the only question in my mind is the timing, Stephen. I think it's very likely that Kim Jong-un will come to New York, and I think it's equally likely that President Trump will go to Pyongyang, and both events will probably happen before November for political reasons.
Let me ask you, before I turn to our audience here, about the international complex. Much has been said in the last day or two about China. Has it been marginalized, left out? I've been asked, has it been pulling strings? Is there a benefit? Japan, seemingly sidelined or having concerns, caught unawares, it seems, about this notion of military exercises. South Korea, on the one hand, the Ministry of National Defense perhaps not knowing, but on the other hand, the Blue House seemingly very much in concert with the White House in its approach. And beyond South Korea, Japan, and China, Frank, you could just come back from Russia. What potential role there?
Well, look, as Keith said earlier at the beginning, solving this problem requires guarantors. The U.S. and North Korea mistrust each other greatly, mistrust each other's ability to follow through on commitments, and having some kind of international guarantor mechanism. We had it in the six-party talks, we had it in the agreed framework, and I think we'll need to have it now. And to stick with the road trip analogy for a minute, it's like we're in this old Ford 150 truck that everyone in Texas, where I grew up, used to drive around. And you got a bench seat in the front, not bucket seats. So you got room for 3 passengers up front and 3 in the back. And so, we've got a situation where I'm hoping that Moon Jae-in is going to be the driver of this truck. He's the grown-up in this process with the most experience. Next to him, probably right next to him, you got Kim Jong-un. Now, he's growing up, but he's a teenage driver you don't want him behind the wheel. And next to him, you got President Trump riding shotgun with an arm out the window and kind of spreading out on the bench. And in the back seat, you got Xi Jinping. The Chinese are essential to have on this trip. They're 90% of the trade with North Korea is with China. China is one of the participants in the Korean War, obviously, and one of the signers of the armistice, and they have to sign any peace. So China's got to be in the car with you. Next to him, you got Abe. Now, Prime Minister Abe is car sick. He doesn't feel well. He's not happy on the road, which is very bumpy for him. And every time he makes a suggestion, the North Koreans or the South Koreans tell him to butt out. But he needs to be in the car because the Japanese also are important players, and we can't defend the Korean Peninsula without our bases in Japan. And at the end of the day, if there's peace, there's a potential pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for the North Koreans because the Japanese paid major reparations to South Korea when they normalized relations and established a full normal relationship with South Korea. They have made a similar promise to the North, to the tune of probably tens of billions of dollars over time. And so there's a reason why North Korea ought to address the concerns of abductions and other issues with Japan. And then finally, I did just get back from Moscow. And, I think President Putin needs to be in the way back. He's back there along with maybe some bales of hay and some mulch and stuff. But he needs to be in the car too. So I think the process that we're on is one that is going to be long, difficult, lots of roadblocks, lots of detours. And we've only just started it. Only just started it. And my main concern is like a president with ADD who may either lose interest or, because of his somewhat mercurial nature, might flip back to all drama all the time if he senses that the North Koreans are not following through on their commitments. And so I think this car right now, we need new shocks and we need a bumper and maybe airbags. This is like a 1968 Ford 150, and it does not have the equipment we need to make this trip. We need to augment it if we're going to get to the destination someday.
Steve, we're in a situation where Donald Trump happens to be president at the time that North Korea has now the capability of hitting the United States with an intercontinental ballistic missile. That is the reality. It is the responsibility of the President of the United States to deal with the North Koreans on this issue. To the degree that the Chinese want to be helpful, great. To the degree that Russia would like to be helpful, great. Because of our relationship, our special relationships with Japan and South Korea, obviously they need to be consulted along the way. But at the end of the day, President Trump is responsible for the defense of the people of the United States. They will hold him accountable. That is on his mind. And so hopefully this beginning of direct communication of a new way with North Korea will endure. And I think I think the Chinese have already been helpful. And I suspect they will be in the future. But ultimately, we have to remember that China's interests related to North Korea are not the same as ours. China, as you know, has a focus on regional stability. China is willing to tolerate North Korea having a nuclear weapons program. We are not. And so the Chinese will address this over a longer term. We need to have this addressed now, especially the ICBM component of this. And I'm confident that in the president's mind, he must address this prior to departing office.
We sit in the shadow of the United Nations, and we saw the Secretary General use his good offices to warn against sleepwalking into conflict. We saw a visit by the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs in December to Pyongyang, which may have helped create some new realities in terms of their understanding. What do you see in terms of the potential role for the United Nations going forward?
Well, the UN has offices in Pyongyang, and UNICEF is there, and World Food Program has been there in the past. And any process of engagement with North Korea very quickly is going to run up against the enormous challenges inside the country in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, education, every measurement of human well-being. And it ought to be a global task to try to assist the North Koreans in building a society that addresses the basic needs of their people. And the UN has a legitimacy for the North Koreans in part because they operate in a transparent way inside the country, and in part because they're not judged to be, a U.S. Proxy you know. So I would hope that one of the benefits of any process of dialogue and peace between the U.S. and North Korea would be that the rather severe restrictions affecting financing, affecting travel, licensing of exports that the United States has imposed on North Korea as part of the maximum pressure campaign. I would hope that those could be gradually lifted as the North Koreans respond, hopefully favorably, to the challenges of denuclearization, because that ought to relieve, if you will, the U.S. taxpayer from the principal responsibility of trying to rebuild North Korea. North Korean people are hardworking, industrious. They're more interested in the technology and the software than they are about becoming an aid-dependent country. And the UN, I think, could play a major role in that, Steve.
The UN can become a good parking place for Frank's car.
Great. Well said.
Actually, in my opinion, the UN Secretary General, Guterres, is to be commended for his personal interest in working to ensure a peaceful resolution of the North Korea situation versus a war. Secondly, it's my observation that UN officials at a variety of levels are working to educate the North Koreans about the full role of the UN, that it's not simply about imposing sanctions, that's part of it, but that the UN could help better inform the North Koreans about the UN serving as a point of conflict resolution, mediation, etc. I suspect this is going on behind the scenes, which is very important. Finally, there are a number of Americans and Europeans who are involved in so-called Track 2 talks with North Korea, which I think have an important role. There are a number of countries outside of the United States who fund Track 2 discussions between Americans and North Koreans or others and North Koreans. And I think the United Nations could help ensure that these various country sponsors are talking to each other, comparing notes with each other. The Track 2 process is very important, but the Track 2 process must not become a source of competition in terms of who can first bring peace to the peninsula. So I'm grateful for the sponsorship of all of these countries, but I believe that there's an opportunity for the UN to encourage them to talk to each other and to be better informed as to what each other may be doing.
Yeah, that coordination mechanism is real important. I mean, you see it in conflict zones around the world. When I was in Cambodia with the UN working on a peacekeeping mission there, it was the UN that hosted the weekly conference of all the NGOs, all the alphabet soup of the private NGOs, to basically deconflict, share out information, share experience, share knowledge, best practices, all the rest. If North Korea, if we're successful, and we make progress on peace with North Korea, there's going to be a flood of NGOs who are going to want to establish operations there. And there's going to be a need for information sharing, for experience sharing, for coordination mechanisms. And the UN, I think, really ought to be at the core of that.
Wonderful. Please, Nick.
Nick Brandt, member of the board.
Nick Brandt, member of the board of the Korea Society. I'm going to ask you both a question which I fully appreciate is impossible for you to answer, but I'd still like you to have a go at it.
Thank you.
Those are the best kind.
And that is, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, do you really think that Kim Il-jung would ultimately agree to dismantle his nuclear program?
I believe it is a possibility. Your question is right on the mark in the sense that I am amazed at the number of Americans, Europeans, others who are always declaring what North Korea will or will not do. And many of these declarations are made by people who've never talked to North Korea, and never been to North Korea. And it's only been recently that Kim Jong-un has actually been communicating with the rest of the world. My personal opinion, it is unlikely that this will occur in the short term. However, I would dare not suggest that North Korea will never denuclearize. There is too much at stake here in terms of North Korea itself. There are too many other dynamics which enter into this picture. And so my personal opinion is I would not say that North Korea will never denuclearize.
When I interviewed for my job with Senator Biden, I was a 32-year-old young State Department intelligence analyst looking for my first big job on Capitol Hill, and he had already decided to hire me. I didn't know that. So I went to sit down on his couch and be interviewed by him. And he said, "Now, Frank, what are the 3 most important words you will ever say to me?" And I had not prepared for that question. So I said, "I don't know." He said, "Exactly." He says, "Don't bullshit me." I don't know the answer to your question. If I told you that North Korea won't denuclearize, would it be appropriate for us then not to try? There's only one path on the Korean Peninsula that avoids either conflict or a prolongation of the status quo, which is fraught with all manner of risks and suffering. Risks of proliferation. We've seen already the North Koreans build a nuclear power plant in Syria that the Israelis had to bomb, which had only one purpose, the production of plutonium for nuclear weapons. So I think it's the job of diplomats to turn the impossible into the unlikely. And I think it's unlikely, if you ask my opinion, it's unlikely that we'll see North Korea denuclearize completely, certainly anytime soon, maybe never. But anyone who pretends that they can answer that question with certainty is lying to you. They're BSing, they're bullshitting you. Because the truth is we don't know. And the truth is that Kim Jong-un may not have decided himself. And the truth is that Kim Jong-un himself may not be the only voice that matters in this inside North Korea, although he clearly is the most important voice. So I think we should try, because the alternatives are very unattractive.
Those are the words I'd like to draw to a close with, and thank you both for being with us tonight. A round of applause for Frank Jannuzi and Keith Luse.
Thank you, Steve.
I'd also like, before I present them with some gifts that we'd like to send them off with, I would like to thank very much our Associate Director for Policy, Jonathan Corrado, and his mother who came tonight, as well as our very talented intern team who support Jonathan greatly, and the entire team of the Korea Society. We're very honored to have several members of our board here tonight. Please do take the opportunity to meet them at the conclusion, and they do so much to make the Korea Society a powerful force in educating Americans on Korea. To that end, please join us at koreasociety.org for membership and upcoming events. I'd like to take a moment and thank sincerely the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, which co-sponsored this evening's event, and which does so much important work to elevate a range of foreign policy issues of American concern to an audience here in New York. So please do look for the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's website and seek out membership as well. They're close strategic partners of the Korea Society, and we count them as both friends and colleagues. Thank you for taking the time, and we'd ask that you pass along the good word. Tomorrow night we have an arts event here, which will be the opening of this wonderful exhibition that you see up on the wall and in the gallery by the famed late artist Lee Young-no. And so if you'd like to come back tomorrow night and spend some time doing a gallery walk and enjoying some refreshments, do see our webpage to sign up at koreasociety.org. And now to add to our thanks, we have a few gifts for Keith and Frank in the tradition of honoring Mike Mansfield. This is a photo that was taken by Associated Press in 1970 of Senator Mansfield landing in Cambodia. And the gesture is what's moving, right? The humility, the insight, the wisdom. And I wanted to present this to Frank to take back to the office. It's stamped and all the press credentials on the back. And hoping he doesn't have a copy, but the very well-read Keith Luse, Majority Leader, about Mansfield's career on the Hill. One of our most wonderful friends and supporters, a graduate of our Kim-Ku Professional Series program here, is Julia Quincy. And she very kindly took the time to copy and bind Mike Mansfield's master's thesis on American diplomatic relations with Korea, 1866 to 1910. So we'd like to send you both off with a copy of that.
Thank you.
And Julia, stand up. Thank you for your generosity as always.
This is, if you'll allow me, this is a rare thing. We have a copy of it on our website at mansfieldfoundation.org, mansfieldfdn.org. But most people are familiar with Mike Mansfield, who I had the privilege of meeting a couple of times because he was a very special friend to Joe Biden. It was Mansfield who, after Joe Biden lost his wife and daughter in the tragic car accident just before he was sworn in to be a U.S. senator, it was Mansfield who called up Joe Biden, and Biden was going to quit to take care of his two boys who were injured in the car accident. One of whom, Bo, passed away last year. And Mansfield called up Senator Biden. He says, "No, Senator, don't quit. The Senate will be your family now." And then every week in his freshman term of the Senate, Mansfield would call in Joe Biden for a little one-on-one in the Majority Leader's office. And Biden was so naive, he thought that every freshman senator was getting that treatment. But it was just him. But anyway, Ambassador Mansfield was the longest serving U.S. ambassador in history anywhere, 11 years under both Democratic and Republican presidents to Japan. But he wrote his master's thesis, as I'm fond of reminding people in Asia, on U.S.-Korea diplomatic history. And the thesis stands up pretty well, too. It's an interesting read. So thank you so much. It means a lot to me. Appreciate that.
And I have one final gift, which is my piece de resistance. I collect a bit of political Americana and came across something that I thought would be of interest to our guests. As you can tell, with their brilliant minds and their insider knowledge of Washington, it opens many doors. But of course, Washington now sees some doors shut with the polarization, and who knows when the doors open, when it's shut. So I was concerned that they might not always be able to walk back in the Senate chambers, though I suspect they could. So I have here two United States Chamber passes with the name open, I assume you'll pen in your own, that are actually dated from 1961 and that are signed by Senator Mike Mansfield.
Oh, great.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all. You're our gift to the Korea Society, and please consider giving back at koreasociety.org. It is 7 o'clock. We've enjoyed this hour immensely. Thanks, and have a wonderful evening, and we'll continue to monitor events as they develop.